So now we're going to take a look here at 1 Timothy chapter 6, and I'm going to just really focus in on verses 1 through 2, which is instructions that should be given to how not only masters treat those who are their slaves, but also how those who are Christian slaves are supposed to respond to their masters, whether they are Christian masters or non-Christian masters. So let's go ahead and just read the text first. 1 Timothy 6, starting verse 1. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves. So, of course, this is a very interesting text for many of us to look at, especially since we approach the subject of slavery from a perspective and an understanding that's quite different than how Paul and many of his readers would have understood it. A couple of things we'll just go ahead and highlight about slavery in the first century Greco-Roman world. Slavery in the Roman Empire was a term that's oftentimes used to describe it as ubiquitous. And by ubiquitous, we just mean it is everywhere. Many, many people have slaves. People can become slaves through lots of different means. You can become a slave because you're a captive of war. You can become a slave very frequently. You become slaves because you have debts and you have to pay off your debts. And so once you've paid off your debts through work, then you are freed. You can also become a slave because your parents were slaves and you were born into slavery. People became slaves in different ways. But it is important to kind of remember that Greco-Roman slavery and slavery as it was experienced, particularly in the American context, differed in at least two significant ways. One, it was rarely racially motivated. We don't really see that people become slaves because they belong to a particular ethnic group or because of color of their skin or anything like that. And secondly, freeing slaves, what's also sometimes known as manumission, was a common occurrence, whereas slavery in the American context, most oftenly you were a slave, throughout your whole life. You died as a slave, and people just weren't granted freedom as very frequently. So those are two differences between the American context. Nevertheless, slavery was just as someone has said, slavery was as common in the Roman world as electricity is today in our world. We can hardly imagine living without electricity, how our lives would be disrupted if we did not have electricity. Many people would have thought the same way in terms of slavery. It is just so much ingrained in part of the fabric of life. The inclusion of the admonition to slaves, why does Paul list this? He's just talked about widows and he's talked about elders, and then all of a sudden now you're talking about slaves. So it's a very strange mixture of materials. But remember, the overall concern of First Timothy has to do with false teachers and the impact of false teachers. And it may be that the reason why this admonition and encouragement to slaves in particular is stressed is because the false teachers may have influenced some slaves, and that has created tensions between the master-slave relationship, especially if there's this idea that as people who are in Christ, they are now freed from all types of restrictions, all types of expectations. They don't live bound by anything. So a slave could think, well, listen, I'm in Christ, and therefore I no longer have to respect, I no longer have to live under the confinements of slavery. I can reject that institution. I can reject that relationship. And of course, that would be uh, quite a severe thing to occur in the relationship between the slave and his master. Certainly, a non-believing master, a non-Christian master would see that any Christian slave of his who comes in and says, "I'm no longer going to recognize myself as a slave," would probably be treated in a very different way by the master, in a very hostile way. But what about the relationship with a Christian master? So, what are going to be the dynamics then if a person thinks that these social institutions can just be walked away from? So, so the letter here is trying to address this concern, most likely because of the false teacher's influence. A couple of things as we dig a little deeper into these verses. First of all, Paul gives two rationales for slaves to be respectful to their masters. The one, so that the non-Christian Gentiles will not blaspheme God because of their disrespectful behavior. So he says, giving masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. The idea of being slandered, being blasphemed, being spoken of negatively and falsely, that if Christian slaves are saying to their masters, I don't need to respect you, because I'm no longer recognizing the old relationship that I had with you as a slave. I'm not recognizing that identity anymore. Then certainly the Christian movement, the Christian activity would be seen as subversive and as a threat to the Roman Empire. Because, for the Romans, everything is about order and maintaining order. And if you have rebellious slaves and you find out the reason why that they're rebelling is because they believe that they no longer have to submit to their masters because now they have this new identity in Christ, then that would be seen as something to address, something to stop. So anyway, that could be one of the reasons why Paul is trying to encourage slaves to respect their masters, and the other is because their masters are Christians, and the slave's service to them brings them benefit. Now, not all of them are Christians. It says those who have believing masters. In other words, those who have masters who believe in the gospel, those who believe in Christ, they should show them respect. Now, we need to delve a little bit more here into this verse 2, as the NIV version has, because they are fellow believers. But let's see on the second half of that is instead they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves. So they're trying to think here, if your master is a Christian, as a Christian, you would want to do that which helps a brother or sister in Christ. You would want to do something that benefits them. And so serving your master well, because they are a Christian, should be part of the rationale behind those actions. So, as I said, let's talk just a little bit more about this phrase, because they are brothers or because they are fellow believers. This phrase can have one of two meanings, at least one or two meanings. There may be others, but here are at least two. One is slaves should not show less respect to their masters because they are, and maybe we have this kind of concept of an ellipsis where a word is kind of left out, but it's understood because they are merely brothers, and so are not superior to them. In other words, you want to you don't want to disrespect them because they are merely just a Christian, so that now, because of that relationship, I no longer have to respect them because they aren't a superior to me. It could have that idea, Or it could be that slaves should respect their masters because they are brothers and should be treated with love. And I think this may be the more likely explanation here, that because they are brothers, you would want to act in a particular way. And so it's a little unclear how that phrase, because they are fellow believers, is operating, what the meaning is, but here are two possibilities. All right, I'm going to leave this short little section on verses 1 and 2, and then we'll move on to look at the rest of the verses.